A steel tube, 49 meters long, split open like a gutted fish along its upper seam. Bois Carré, Pas-de-Calais, September 1944. 2 weeks after Canadian troops push through, a Royal Engineers survey party climbs over the blast walls and finds the launch ramp mostly intact. No warhead, no aircraft, just the ramp itself. A slotted tube on a concrete cradle, tilted at 6 degrees, aimed at London 140 miles away. They had seen this shape in reconnaissance photographs for a year. Grainy, grey, unconvincing. This is the first time British engineers stand next to one and put their hands on the metal. Inside that tube, they find a residue clinging to the slot. A pale crust, faintly metallic, corroded in patterns that look deliberate. It takes 3 days at Farnborough to work out what caused it. When they do, the answer connects this dirt French field to a British torpedo program already running for 2 years, and to a submarine that will not exist for another decade. Nobody at Bois Carré is thinking about submarines. They are thinking about the ramp. Captain Alan Wilson of the Royal Engineers Bomb Disposal Unit, this is his second ski site in 6 days, walks the length of the tube first. Before anyone touches a tool, he is looking for booby traps. The Germans have wired demolition charges into equipment before, and a live launch tube is not something you want to learn about the hard way. He finds nothing. The site was abandoned in a hurry. Whatever the Germans wanted to hide, they didn't have time to burn it. That is the detail that matters. This ramp was not sanitized for capture. It is dirty, corroded, and complete. The first one the Allies will get to examine in this condition, rather than in pieces scattered by a bomb strike. Wilson's team clears the site for the technical intelligence officers who arrive 4 days later in early September. Among them is a young propulsion specialist attached to the Ministry of Aircraft Production, sent because someone at Medmenham flagged this particular ramp as unusually well preserved. He brings a case of tools that look wrong for the job: pH papers, sample bottles, a hand-cranked centrifuge. He is not here for the airframe. The Fieseler FY-103 itself, the flying bomb, has already been picked apart at Farnborough since June. When the first crashed examples came down on British soil, what nobody has recovered intact until now is the launch mechanism, the thing that got it moving in the first place. If this is the kind of story you want more of, real engineering, pulled apart piece by piece, with the people who actually did the work, that's what this channel does every week. Hit subscribe, and you won't miss the next one. The propulsion officer, his notes name him only as Flight Lieutenant Reeves, MAP Technical Intelligence, measures the slot running along the top of the launch tube. It's just under 3 inches wide, cut the full 49-meter length of the ramp, sealed along its edges with a spring-loaded rubber lip. He reaches inside with a torch and finds the piston. It is still there, jammed a third of the way down. The mechanism failed before this particular V-1 ever launched. The piston head is roughly a foot across, machined from steel with a lug on top that projects up through the slot. Reeves writes in his report that the lug is what connects the piston to the missile sitting on top of the tube. The missile rides the outside of the ramp. The piston rides the inside. The slot is how they talk to each other, and how the rubber lip reseals itself the instant the lug passes, so the tube stays airtight behind it. He sits back on his heels for a moment and says, to nobody in particular, that it's a very elegant way to solve a very stupid problem. The stupid problem is this: the V-1's pulse jet cannot generate enough static thrust to get the airframe moving. Below roughly 200 miles an hour, the engine won't sustain combustion at all. The Germans need something to accelerate a 1-ton missile from zero to flying speed in less than 50 meters. That same week, in Normandy, the British Second Army is grinding through the bocage south of Caen, taking a village and its hedgerows at a cost that gets measured in individual tanks. Two very different kinds of engineering problem on either side of the channel, both being solved with whatever gets the job done fastest. The piston is the answer to the ramp's problem. Something has to drive it, hard, in one violent stroke. That something is what Reeves is about to find. 40 meters from the ramp, half buried under camouflage netting the Germans didn't have time to properly strip away, the team finds a small wheeled cart. Reeves's report calls it the Dampferzeugungsanlage, the steam-generating plant. It's roughly the size of a large wardrobe with 2 tanks, a mixing chamber, and a length of armored hose running to the base of the launch tube. He opens the first tank. Empty, but the interior is coated in the same pale crust he saw in the ramp slot. He takes a scraping. The second tank still has residue in the bottom, a few pints of dark, granular sludge. He bottles a sample and seals it. Back at Farnborough, the chemists identify the first substance as concentrated hydrogen peroxide, roughly 80% strength. The Germans call it T-Stoff. The second is a solution of sodium or potassium permanganate, Z-Stoff. Separately, both are stable enough to transport. Combined in the right ratio, the reaction is close to instantaneous. One of the Farnborough chemists, testing a diluted sample in a beaker, writes a single line in the margin of his notebook. Reaction complete in under a second. Temperature exceeds boiling point of water immediately. He underlines immediately twice. Here's what that means in plain terms. When the two chemicals meet, the permanganate acts as a catalyst. It doesn't get consumed, it just makes the peroxide fall apart almost instantly. And hydrogen peroxide breaking down releases oxygen and water vapor, along with a huge burst of heat, enough to flash that water into superheated steam in a fraction of a second, with no external boiler, no burner, no ignition source at all. Reeves calculates the volumes from what's left in the tanks. The generator is producing steam at a pressure high enough to drive that piston the full length of the tube in under 2 seconds, accelerating the V-1 to roughly 200 miles an hour by the time it leaves the ramp. Fast enough for the pulse jet to sustain itself in flight. No combustion, no moving parts beyond the piston itself. Just 2 liquids meeting in a chamber and the violence of that meeting doing the work. A war context cut because this is worth remembering. The ramp Reeves is standing on was built to fire at London. 96 of these ski sites were constructed across northern France through the winter of 1943 into 1944, most of them found by photo interpreters at RAF Medmenham, squinting at stereoscopic pairs of aerial photographs, looking for a shape nobody had a name for yet. Constance Babington-Smith's team called the storage buildings ski sites because from directly overhead, that's what the curved roofs looked like. It took months of bombing, Operation Crossbow, running from December 1943 through the following summer, to keep most of them from ever firing a shot. This ramp at Bois Carré is one of the ones Crossbow silenced before it launched a single V-1. Reeves is examining a weapon that never got to prove itself against the city it was built for. Reeves goes back to the ramp tube itself and looks more closely at the crust lining the slot. The same pale residue from the piston chamber. It isn't uniform. It's heaviest near the base of the tube and thins out toward the muzzle. He asks the site's remaining ground crew, 3 Luftwaffe technicians taken prisoner nearby, brought back under guard for questioning, what maintenance the ramp required between launches. Their answer, recorded in the interrogation notes, surprises him more than anything he's found in the hardware. Every launch corrodes the tube. The steam reaction isn't clean. Residual peroxide and permanganate byproduct eat into the steel lining and the rubber slot seal. After each firing, ground crew in rubber boots and oilskins had to walk the length of the ramp with brooms, washing the tube down before the next missile could be loaded. Reeves writes that the corrosion he's looking at represents perhaps a dozen washes, done under pressure, on a site that was meant to fire a V-1 every 20 minutes at full tempo. He puts his hand flat on the tube's outer casing, where the metal has pitted down to a rough, sugared texture, and says that whoever built this ramp accepted from day one that it would eat itself alive doing its job. A human moment. Reeves takes his tea from a thermos one of the sappers has been keeping warm on a portable stove, and it goes cold in his hand while he rereads his own notes on the corrosion pattern. He isn't looking at the ramp anymore. He's doing arithmetic in his head. How many launches, how much peroxide, how much of this corrosive residue got produced across 96 sites over months, and where all of it must have gone. Rivers, soil, drainage ditches behind blast walls. Nobody in London has asked that question yet. He writes it down as something to raise back at the ministry. At the muzzle end of the ramp, Reeves finds a heavy timber and steel structure, what his report calls a buffer or brake. The piston, having done its job accelerating the missile, doesn't fly off with it. It's designed to separate from the launching lug right at the end of the tube and slam into this buffer, which absorbs the impact and holds the piston in place. He measures the buffer's construction and does a rough calculation of the forces involved. A steel piston, weighing several hundred pounds, arriving at over 200 miles an hour, stopped dead in a few feet. The German ground crew tell him something he didn't expect. Each site was only issued 2 pistons. After every launch, the spent piston had to be manually winched back down the tube, cleaned and reloaded. A job that took several minutes and several men, done in the open, on a site that Allied bombers were actively hunting. Reeves underlines this in his report. The entire rate of fire for a ski site, the thing that determined how many V-1s could hit London in a day, was bottlenecked by 2 lumps of steel and a winch crew working in the open air under threat of air attack. Back at Farnborough, the sample Reeves bottled from the generator trailer goes through full analysis. The chemists confirm the concentration, close to 80% hydrogen peroxide. Stabilized, manufactured to a purity that surprises them. This isn't laboratory-grade peroxide improvised for a battlefield weapon. It's an industrial product, made to a specification, at a concentration Britain has almost no domestic production capacity to match. One of the senior chemists, reading the analysis alongside intelligence summaries already circulating from captured U-boat pens, makes the connection first. This same chemical, at similar concentrations, has already turned up in reports on a completely different weapon. A German submarine propulsion system developed by an engineer named Helmuth Walter, using peroxide to run a turbine underwater without needing outside air at all. The V-1's launch ramp and a stealth submarine engine are drawing on the same chemistry, refined by the same handful of German industrial plants. Reeves's report, when it lands on desks in London, gets read by people who have nothing to do with flying bombs. The war context, one more time, because it matters here. While Reeves is writing this up in September 1944, the last V-1 ramps in range of London are being overrun by Allied ground forces, and the launches against the city are ending. Not because the Germans ran out of will, but because the army is physically taking the ground the ramps stand on. The V-1 campaign killed close to 6,000 people in Britain and injured tens of thousands more. It is also, by September, effectively over as a ground launch threat to London. What Reeves is examining is already history. What he's about to flag is still the future. Reeves's final report doesn't end with the ramp. It ends with a recommendation that the ministry treat the German peroxide propulsion program, not the V-1 specifically, but the underlying chemistry and the men who built it, as a priority intelligence target once Germany falls. He didn't know it yet, but he'd just written the opening line of a chase that would run for the next 15 years. In May 1945, a Royal Naval Intelligence Unit 30 Assault Unit reaches Walterwerke in Kiel before it can be destroyed. Helmuth Walter is there. So are his files, so is a submarine, the Type 17 U-1407. Built to run on exactly the chemistry Reeves traced back from a French cornfield 8 months earlier. The British raise the submarine, recommission her under the Royal Navy as HMS Meteorite, and bring Walter himself to Britain to keep working. He spends the next 3 years at Barrow-in-Furness. His peroxide chemistry becomes the propulsion system for 2 more Royal Navy submarines, HMS Explorer and HMS Excalibur, built specifically to test how fast a submarine could go if it didn't need air to breathe. Explorer would later be nicknamed by her own crew HMS Exploder. The chemistry that flung V-1s at London was exactly as violent inside a steel hull as it was inside a steel launch tube. The corrosion, the washing crews, the pitted metal Reeves ran his hand over in a French wood. It was never a flaw specific to the ramp. It was the nature of the chemical itself. And the Royal Navy spent the better part of a decade learning that lesson the hard way, in their own boats, because a bomb disposal officer traced a crust of residue back to its source in September 1944. 200 miles an hour, from a standing start, in under 2 seconds, using nothing but 2 liquids meeting each other. That was the whole trick. No fire, no moving engine parts beyond a single piston. Just chemistry, doing in an instant what a jet engine couldn't do at rest. Britain didn't just stop the V-1. Britain spent the next decade quietly absorbing the one piece of German chemistry that made it fly, and put it to sea. The ramp at Bois Carré is still there today if you know where to look. Overgrown, half buried in a French wood that has reclaimed most of the site. The concrete cracked and softened by 80 years of weather. Most of the launch tubes elsewhere didn't survive. They were scrapped for the steel, or bulldozed as farmland was reclaimed after the war. A section of one launch ramp sits today in the Imperial War Museum at Duxford, alongside a V-1 mounted as if caught mid-launch. Visitors walk past it in a few seconds. A rusted metal rail, a missile shaped like a stubby aircraft, a small printed panel explaining what a flying bomb was. What the panel doesn't say is that the tube itself was a chemistry set built at the scale of a building, and that the same reaction, refined and tamed, went on to send a Royal Navy submarine to sea a decade later, named after the very violence that first defined it. The ramp that never got a proper ending in the war it was built for got one anyway, underwater, flying a different flag.